we can now look for one more angle on cryonics. It's an angle that we've heard a little bit about, which is how to improve its marketing so that more people are prepared to think about it and engage. And to discuss that, I want to invite up to the stage Paul Spiegel. Paul, yes, I see you coming. And Paul has a different background again. He has involved in many initiatives and projects, some with a legal background and some using many other parts of his brain. So Paul, tell us about better marketing for a modern society in 20 minutes or less.
20 minutes or less?
Yes.
All right. Do we have a presenter somewhere? Excellent. Thank you. Hi, my name is Paul Spiegel. I am a different perspective. I'm mostly an attorney. I've been involved in transhumanism and life extension for many years. And among other things, I also do sideline in marketing. One of the things that's occurred to me about cryonics is that it's been marketed in terms of science. It's been marketed as a scientific technique to preserve life. But there's a disconnect, as Ramon and especially Alba pointed out, between that fundamental science and the perceptions of the market, which see things very differently. So when I was asked to give a talk here at this function, I thought about how to connect the existing perceptions of the public with the future-looking things that we're doing as transhumanists with regard to cryonics. And I came up with the concept of a better marketing system for cryonics. Oh, there we go. We all know what cryopreservation is. I'm not going to waste too much time with that. But because we know what this is, it's incumbent upon us as transhumanists to be evangelists, to help other people to understand what's going on. We have in the cryopreservation industry a very promising industry which needs to be portrayed as being in the public's interest as is presently understood. Now, as things are presently understood, we take people when they die and we preserve them or we store them or we dispose of them. And cryonics is rather like that. It is a method, a viable method of storing or disposing of physical remains after death, however that's defined. We may not like to talk about it this way, but this is how the public sees it. Now, unlike the other methods of dealing with dead bodies, cryonics is the only method that actually has a reasonable possibility of reanimation. And it's presently, as Alba pointed out, and Rudy pointed out, it's quite expensive, but it's increasingly competitive with traditional and emerging funeral methods. So I think we have to examine these funeral methods. The problem that we have with cryonics right now in the public mind is that there has been no proven success at reanimation. Now, Natasha and I have talked about this. She's had wonderful success with a worm, but that doesn't speak much to the public. The problem that we have with cryopreservation at this point in the public's general imagination is, it doesn't work. I mean, not yet. We have to prove that somebody can bring back a mammal before the public will acknowledge that maybe this will work for them. It also has a fairly high ick factor. You tell people about cryopreservation, you say, wait, you're going to cut off my head and put it in a vat full of liquid nitrogen? That's kind of gross. Well, that limits the market right now. The potential clientele is limited to true believers with immense faith in science. And that's a pretty small category of the overall market. Basically, few people choose cryonics. Fewer than 4,000 people right now have either been cryopreserved or signed up to be cryopreserved. You compare that to the vast numbers of people that die every single day, one a second, as somebody said earlier today. And you realize that there is essentially no market penetration. So the question becomes how to market cryopreservation to the vast market of people who could benefit from it if only they would consider that it would be useful to them. And that's basically the suggestion here. We need to market cryonics not as a path to reanimation, which is really the primary concept right now, but rather as a viable alternative to other existing funeral methods. Look, let's face it, everybody understands that right now everybody's going to die, and when they do, we're going to have to do something with the remains. Nobody likes to really face this, but anybody who's ever lost somebody knows that something has to be done. You can't just leave them there in their armchair. So, what we need to do as transhumanist, is to help people compare and contrast the other methods of dealing with funeral care, promote cost efficiency, factoring in storage costs, cemetery burials, or columbarium storage of ashes, promote reanimation not as the primary goal of cryonics, but as a valuable secondary benefit that may accrue if science progresses as we believe it will. Essentially, what we need to do is not promise them reanimation, but give them the possibility of it. And that, I think, is where we go. Now, in order to do this, I wanted to go through and review a few traditional methods, because everybody knows that these methods are the way to go. Everybody's going to have to dispose of someone's body at some point in the future, until someday we solve death, and then nobody dies. But until then, we have to worry about these methods. Now, the oldest one we've got right now is the ritual burial from the Paleolithic era, where you basically dig a hole, prepare your body, put it in the hole with flowers, tools, jewelry, ornaments. Now, people probably thought that there was a reanimation potential there. We don't know what it is, but they were burying valuable things with these people. They were burying stone tools, and in a time when survival was paramount, stone tools were very useful. Why would you put these in a grave if you didn't think there was a possibility of reanimation? Now, the actual probability of reanimation for a Paleolithic burial is 0. We know that now. And as far as the cost, going back to Rudy and Alba's concept, the cost was labor intensive, but there really wasn't much to it unless you factor in the value of those stone tools, which can be substantial. Now, of course, science has always stepped in and tried to go one better. So the scientific method, say 3,000-4,000 years ago, was developed by the ancient Egyptians, great scientists in their day. They mummified bodies. What did they do with bodies? They removed the internal organs, except for the heart. They put them in jars, and they desiccated the body with something called natron, which basically dried it out. And the mummified body and the jars were placed in a tomb, sarcophagus inside a tomb, with tools, ornaments, other aids to the afterlife. Now, we know from Egyptian writings that there was a very, very high perceived possibility of reanimation there. Indeed, there's a direct correlation, according to the Egyptians, between the cost of your mummification and the probability of a successful entry into the afterlife. Look at King Tut, for example. The cost of his mummification and entombment was vast, even relative to the standards of his day. If somebody else had been mummified without that kind of production, perhaps his reanimation probability would have been lower. But we know that the actual reanimation probability, no matter what faith the Egyptians put into it, was still 0. And as far as the cost, well, King Tut's tomb is legendary. Now, there's a cheaper way to go. It's still in use right now. It's called sky burial. The Tibetans and other people living in the Himalayas do it. It's very simple. It's very basic. It's predicated on the idea that the soul leaves the body. So you take the body out, you put it on a hillside, and you leave it out there to be eaten by vultures. Yes. Now, the cost of this is modest. You have to drag your body out there to be eaten by vultures. The reanimation probability, as you may probably guess, is also 0. Again, science steps in where it's needed and technology takes over. Let's say that you're not living out on a mountainside in the Himalayas, but instead in a densely populated city like Mumbai, a place where there just aren't a lot of open hillsides. Well, that's been solved by science too. The Parsi came up with something called dakma, towers of silence, which are essentially large stone towers with a big oculus in the middle, and around the perimeter they lay out dead bodies to be eaten by vultures. Again, the cost is fairly nominal once you've built the dakma, and they last a long time, being solid stone structures. The reanimation probability, again, is 0. Now let's go into modern methods. Remember, these are the ones that people consider today. The people that we look at and say, well, you want to do cryopreservation? That's fine. Here are your other options. And the first option that we know about, this is the big one, is cemetery burial. And very much like cryopreservation, the methodology is kind of fundamental. You drain the blood and you replace it with fluid. The difference is instead of a cryoprotectant fluid, you replace it with embalming fluid, which in theory is supposed to preserve the body, but in practice only does so for about 20 years. Then the body is placed in a casket and it's buried, where after 20 years or so, it starts to decompose, no matter what people might want to think. They don't like to think about that, but that's how it works. The reanimation probability, of course, is 0. And the cost, well, in the United States, the average cost of a cemetery burial is somewhere between $6,000 and $14,000. That seems very cheap compared to cryonics. However, the real cost can be a lot higher. Princess Diana's funeral cost $11.8 million US. Compare that to $200,000 for an Alcor preservation, it's starting to look cheap. The Pope, John Paul II, 11.6, just slightly under that of the princess. Now, these are public affairs, we get that. Margaret Thatcher's funeral cost $5.3 million. Michael Jackson, though, a garden variety rock star, a popular one, certainly, his funeral was $1 million. And we figured the price of cryopreservation at Alcor to be $200,000. Okay, it's a bargain compared to a rock star's funeral. It's there to be considered. Come on, let's go. Cheaper version is burial at sea. If you happen to have the good luck or the bad luck to die on a ship and there's no place to store your body to bring it back, burial at sea is simple. They put the body into a sack, they weight the bottom of it, or they put it in a perforated casket, and they drop it over the edge so the body can be consumed by sea life. It's elegant, it's very much like a sky burial in its way. The cost is negligible, assuming you have a boat and sack and some weights, and of course the reanimation probability, again, you're guessing this now, is 0. There's cremation. This is the one that everybody thinks of as kind of the clean modern method. Cremation is even simpler. You take a body, you put it in an oven, you heat it up to nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius until everything burns away except the bones and whatever metallic structures might have been put in by surgery. Then you take these out, you grind them up in a machine, you put them in a bag, you call them ashes, and you give them to the next of kin to do with what they please. Usually they put it in an urn and they store it somewhere. The cost depends really on the cost of storage. Urns can be made out of solid gold if you want them to be, and that raises the price a lot. But basically, you're put in your urn and you're left somewhere, either on the mantelpiece or in something called a columbarium, which is essentially a mausoleum for ashes. We know what the cost is. We also know what the reanimation probability is. That's, again, 0. So now we go to emerging methods, and this is where it kind of gets cute. The emerging methods suggest that people have been dissatisfied with the existing methods, but they don't quite know where to go with them. One of the most interesting emerging methods is actually an old one. It's called green burial. You dig a hole, you put the body into it, and you leave it there. That's not legal in most parts of the United States. In fact, it's not legal in a lot of places because we can't just allow people to go digging holes and burying bodies. It sounds like the sort of thing that the mob does after they've assassinated somebody. So you'll notice that the picture that we're using here is actually from Rwanda, where apparently it's more common. A green burial is fairly simple. It's fairly cheap, and mostly the cost involves the price of the plot where you put the body. It's about $2,000 to $3,000, according to the Green Burial Council. Most people don't go that route. They like something similar. There's something called a tree burial, and in a tree burial, the body is put into a biodegradable pod with soil. A sapling of a tree is planted in the top. It's all put into the ground, and the decomposing body feeds the tree. A lot of people like that idea. But so far, nobody's actually done this for a whole body. They have done it for ashes. There's something called a pod urn. The cost of the pod urn is about $500. The cost of the pod casket is not yet available. It's still theoretical, and the reanimation probability for this lovely method of planting trees is still 0. So we get to one more modern method, alkaline hydrolysis. This has a huge ick factor attached to it. You take a body, you put it into a pressurized vessel with a 50-50 solution of lye and water, and you hydrolyze the flesh and all the soft tissue. Essentially, it means you liquefy it, and then you wash it down the drain. You're left with bones, you're left with whatever metallic bits are in there. I happen to have a lot of metal in my body for various reasons. The cost is not very high, it's about $2,400, and the reanimation probability, of course, is still 0. So now we get to our methods, cryopreservation. Think of it not as a way of bringing people back, but as a scientific method of funeral care, one that, as we've said, has not the promise of reanimation, but the possibility. Now, cryopreservation has a methodology very much similar to the others. You drain the blood, you replace it with a solution. The difference is this is a cryoprotectant solution that allows for vitrification of the cells and hopefully for reanimation. The body's put into a container that's stored in liquid nitrogen at something near 200 degrees below 0 Celsius. Now, the reanimation probability here is an interesting one. As we pointed out before, nobody has ever reanimated a mammal. We've reanimated worms. That does not speak to the public. So the perceived reanimation probability is highly user-dependent. I'm sorry for the slide here. But most of us think that reanimation probability is high, and every day that science advances, the reanimation probability becomes higher still. Most of us in this room would say it's almost a given, but none of us will say it's a certainty. We can't. It hasn't been shown to be true, and the empiricists among us know that until there's proof, you just have to work on theory. The actual probability, we don't know yet, but I defy anybody in this room to say it's zero. Now, we have the cost, and this is what hangs people up. This is what Alba and Rudy were discussing. $200,000 is a lot of money to a lot of people, but not if you look at it next to the cost of, let's say, long-term health care, or even short-term health care. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight cancer. Trust me, I know that. Heart disease, a heart transplant isn't cheap either. $200,000 to preserve your body and solve what's wrong with you, possibly bring yourself back from what we consider to be the dead. It's not as expensive as it sounds. It is expensive relative to digging a hole and throwing a body into it, but that's not what we're doing. Now we have Alcor at $200,000, Cryonics Institute about $35,000, Cryoros at $36,000, TransTime, a new company coming up in the San Francisco Bay Area, for about $150,000, and then the Yinfeng Biological Sciences Institute, which we have no data available, but they say they're opening up in China, and presumably they will be cost competitive. There are other organizations as well, and more are coming up all the time. And what we need to do is figure out a way to make the market for these organizations larger than the 4,000 people worldwide who are presently considered to be cryonics candidates or actually preserved as in cryonics. Now, we have the costs here, and the costs on a graph are substantial. But there is still one difference. That is that cryonics has the possibility of reanimation. So is there a difference between what we're doing and what's been done? Well, you'll have to ask yourself, what's the fundamental difference between the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun and the beautiful stainless steel vessels of Alcor, and of course everything in the middle, urns and coffins? I propose that there isn't a hell of a lot of difference. If you tell people that they're going to have their body put somewhere and then give them the advantages that cryonics offers, why on earth would they choose a sarcophagus, a coffin, or an urn? But it's up to us to help them understand that, otherwise they never will. They'll go with the cheap route and accept the fact that the probability of reanimation is zero. So what we need is a new marketing strategy. We need to acknowledge cryopreservation as much as it is a science, as much as it is a very promising new technology. We need to jump the technological gap and bring it back to what people understand. And that is a method of funeral. It's a valid funeral method. It's a way of dealing with a body. Oh, it's a better way of dealing with a body. We know that, but they don't. And this is our job. We have to understand the alternatives. We need to address the ick factor. For those of you that don't know English slang, ick is that sort of disgusted feeling that you get when you see something distasteful. For instance, somebody says, we're going to cut off your head and fill it with cryopreservation fluid. Ick. We're going to put you in an oven and roast you at 1,000 degrees Celsius until you basically disintegrate. Ick. Everything has an ick factor. So we have to basically acknowledge that this is the case and then wipe out the ick factor so that people can compare prices, they can compare methods, and they can compare results. Cryonics is the only one that has a result that people would consider to be positive. We emphasize the reanimation probability not as the primary goal, but as a valuable, perhaps even an essential secondary consideration to people whose requirement right now is we do something with Grandma who died last week. They have to do something with her. If we can get them a few months in advance, they can do something valuable with her rather than just disposing of her. And this is the one thing that they can do for Grandma that might actually bring Grandma back. Now, once cryopreservation is viewed on a level playing field, once it's understood to be functionally comparable to every other method at somebody's disposal, in a situation where they're going to have to choose one, then cryonics becomes something that looks like it might be worth choosing. Right now, it is only that way to those of us who have immense faith in science, and I might say, fairly large resources, because we understand. But there's a whole world out there that doesn't, and it's up to us to help them do that. So, When we come up with something like cryopreservation, people will always rebel. This is a lovely quote on the radio a few weeks ago by John Troyer, who's the director of the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath in the UK. There is a Centre for Death and Society. It's interesting enough. He says there's always a knee-jerk reaction, a response that says that any new method of disposing of a dead body, and in the public mind that's what cryonics is, that any new method of disposing of a dead body will automatically be rejected. And you get a kind of a moral panic at times about that. Now, this is a real Luddite view. It is so conservative and it's so old-fashioned. You know, what's good enough for my parents was good enough for me. It's been this way for 1,000 years or 100,000 years, and that's all we need. It brings to mind an old American gospel song from the 19th century, when technology was something very different. If you think about this song and you replace a couple of words, and forgive me, but the word that they use is religion. If you replace that with cremation or embalming, you get a sense of what we're talking about. I don't know if this will come up or not. I guess it won't. Okay. The song is Give Me That Old Time Religion, and the song goes, it was good enough for my father, it was good enough for my mother, it was good enough for my father, it was good enough for my brother, and it's good enough for me. And it's an old, give me that old-time religion, give me that old-time religion, give me that old-time cremation, it's good enough for me. It's not good enough for me, and it's not good enough for us, and it's not good enough for the world, and it's up to us to show people why that is the case. That's what we do as transhumanists. We can sit in laboratories, we can sit in offices, we can write articles, or we can help the world to understand that what we offer is better than what came before. So that's what we do. And what we need to do here is to get rid of the ick factor. We compare burial, ick, hole in the ground. We compare cremation, ick. We compare alkaline hydrolysis, ick. And then we go out and we get rid of the ick factor. So what we're left with is all earlier methods versus cryopreservation. They all have an ick factor. Trust me, they do. But there's only one that actually offers you more. Cryopreservation can be viewed as the science of funeral care. In that respect, I came up with a lovely little slogan. Cryopreservation is not a promise, it's a possibility. And that's what we need to offer people. As transhumanists, this is part of our goal. I encourage you all to get out there and consider that. Now, I just want to thank a couple of people here. I have my valuable staff, Brianna Azevedo, who helped me to make this thing. I had Steve Garin and Natasha Vita-Moore from a couple of Cryonics institutes that gave me some valuable advice and told me I wasn't insane to take this tack. Appreciate that very much. I also want to acknowledge a bit of collaboration with Deborah Vanderhoek and the Eden Life Centers at Bali. I didn't have time to get them into the slide. They gave me some great perspective on this. And then some companies, Libertas Biomedical, the International Longevity Alliance, the American Longevity Alliance, and the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation, who support all kinds of things that help people to live longer and better lives, as do we all. So I wanted to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That wasn't too weird.
Thank you very much, Paul Siegel.